In the gentle hush of a Roman dawn, before the clamor of empire and the echo of legions, there was a boy named Gaius Octavius, born into a world still reeling from the aftershocks of Julius Caesar's assassination. Young Octavius was not yet the Augustus who would reshape Rome. He was merely a youth with sharp eyes and a lineage that whispered of destiny. The Rome of his childhood was a city of marble and dust, of senators in togas debating the fate of the Republic, and of streets where merchants haggled over olives and grain. The air was thick with the scent of baked bread and the distant clang of blacksmiths at work. It was a city alive yet uncertain, a republic teetering on the edge of transformation. Octavius, though young, was observant. He watched as power shifted like sand beneath the feet of Rome's elite. He listened to the tales of his great-uncle, Julius, the general who had crossed the Rubicon and declared himself dictator. And he learned the art of patience, understanding that the tides of fortune favored those who waited for the right moment to act. When news came that Julius Caesar had named him heir, Octavius did not rush to claim his inheritance. Instead, he measured each step, aligning himself with allies, gauging the mood of the populace and presenting himself not as a usurper, but as a stabilizing force. His ascent was not marked by grand proclamations, but by calculated moves and quiet confidence. As he navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics, Octavius demonstrated a keen understanding of human nature. He knew when to extend an olive branch and when to wield the sword. His alliances, though sometimes uneasy, were forged with a vision of a Rome that could rise above civil strife. The transformation from Octavius to Augustus was not merely a change of name, but a metamorphosis of identity. He became the architect of a new Rome, one that balanced tradition with innovation, authority with benevolence. Under his guidance, the Republic gave way to the Empire, not with a violent upheaval, but with a series of reforms that felt, to many, like a natural evolution. Yet even as Augustus solidified his power, he maintained the facade of republican values. The Senate still convened, magistrates still held office, and the rituals of the Republic continued. But the true power rested with Augustus, the princeps, the first among equals. In the twilight of his life, Augustus could look upon a Rome that had found a semblance of peace and prosperity. The roads stretched to the far corners of the known world. Aqueducts brought fresh water to the cities and the arts flourished. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was his legacy. But as the sun set on his reign, questions lingered. Would his successors uphold the delicate balance he had achieved? Could the empire endure without the guiding hand of its founder? As night enveloped the city, the streets quieted, and the stars emerged over the Tiber, one could almost hear the whispers of history, pondering the path that lay ahead for Rome and the dynasty Augustus had begun. Behind the marbled facade of imperial Rome, amid the scrolls and statues, there stood a woman whose presence shaped the very spine of an empire, Livia Drusilla. While Augustus built the visible Rome, Livia worked in shadows, cultivating the roots of a dynasty that would outlast both of them. She entered Augustus' life not as a queen, for Rome had no queens, but as a partner, sharp of mind, calm in demeanor, and unwavering in ambition. Though still married when they first met, her union with Augustus soon followed, a rare confluence of political strategy and personal harmony. Livia, unlike the tales of scheming women whispered in the colonnades, operated with a serene composure that belied the immense influence she wielded. In the quiet corners of the Palatine Hill, where the marble cooled under the shade of cypress trees, Livia orchestrated a vision not only of family, but of imperial continuity. Her sons from a previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus, were carefully groomed under her watchful eye. It was not favoritism that drove her, but an understanding that dynasties, like gardens, required careful tending. She rarely spoke in the Senate, never marched with the legions, and yet her voice echoed in the decisions Augustus made. She advised, consoled, and at times diverted. She was the trusted confidant whose counsel came not with noise but with nods, whose strength lay not in declarations but in timing. Her influence extended beyond Augustus's reign. As empress, she had learned the art of survival, a subtle maneuver, here a calculated silence there. She knew which rivalries to let simmer and which alliances to nourish. She was not loved by all, but she was respected, and in Rome respect outlasted affection. The imperial court, a place of golden mosaics and veiled ambitions, often whispered her name. Some said she engineered the downfall of rivals. Others claimed she played the long game, ensuring her son Tiberius would eventually wear the laurel. The truth, as always in Rome, lay somewhere between the rumor and the reality. As Augustus aged, growing weary from decades of careful rulership, it was Livia who remained his constant. She cared for him in illness, listened to his reflections, and prepared for the inevitable transition. When he passed, her grief was measured, not because she lacked feeling, but because she understood that mourning was also a moment of political clarity. Tiberius, her son, ascended not to universal acclaim, but to resigned acceptance, and though Augustus had built the path, it was Livia who ensured it was walked. She became Julia Augusta, a title both honorary and strategic, aligning her image with the memory of the deified Augustus. In her later years, Livia resided in her villa surrounded by olive trees and the soft hum of bees. She was both retired and revered, visited by statesmen who still sought her insight, and by family who treaded carefully around the matriarch of the dynasty. Her death, when it came, was quiet, but her memory lingered, etched into statues and commemorated in rites. The dynasty she helped sculpt continued, flawed and fractious, but rooted in the vision she and Augustus had once shared. The moon above Rome, often watching over emperors and their ambitions, shone softly the night Livia passed. The city held its breath, not out of fear but out of a strange reverence for the woman who had mastered the empire not with armies or proclamations, but with whispers and wisdom. In the soft hush that followed the death of Augustus, the city of Rome did not erupt in chaos. Instead, it watched, with breath held and brows furrowed, as a new figure stepped into the sandals of power. Tiberius, son of Livia, stepson of Augustus, and now princeps of the Roman world, did not ascend the throne with joy. His was a reign that began not with celebration, but with silence. Tiberius Claudius Nero was never meant to rule. His early life had been one of military duty and retreat into private contemplation. He was a man who found more comfort in books and stars than in banquets or senatorial games. Yet the intricate web woven by Livia and the necessities of dynastic stability had placed him squarely in the emperor's seat. When he addressed the Senate for the first time as emperor, his words were careful, almost hesitant. Unlike his predecessor, Tiberius did not cloak his rule in grandeur. He offered no sweeping reforms nor glorious promises. What he did offer was continuity, a tether to the legacy of Augustus, a bridge from the past to an uncertain future. Tiberius governed with precision, often with detachment. His laws were thoughtful, his reforms methodical. He maintained the empire's strength, its borders secure, its coffers filled. Yet something in him resisted the splendor and spectacle that had characterized Augustus's reign. Where Augustus had been a master of image, Tiberius remained a man of shadows. Rome noticed. The people, ever fond of drama and display, grew restless. The Senate, once wary of Augustus's power, found Tiberius frustrating in his reluctance to charm or manipulate. His relationship with the Roman elite became strained, his silences misconstrued as contempt, his absences as disdain. He withdrew more and more to the island of Capri, a place of high cliffs and whispering winds. There, surrounded by the azure, sea and the solitude of rocky paths, Tiberius found solace. The villa he built was less a palace and more a retreat for a weary soul. Letters from Rome reached him often, but he responded with increasing brevity, delegating more to trusted advisers, notably the ambitious and feared Sejanus. Capri became, in the Roman imagination, a place of secrets. Rumors flowed like wine at feasts, of strange rituals, of spies and sentences carried out under moonlight. Whether these tales were true or merely born from Rome's need for drama, they cast long shadows over Tiberius's reign. And yet he ruled. For over 2 decades, he guided the empire with an unseen hand. He did not seek love, nor did he inspire it, but he maintained peace, and in Rome peace was a currency greater than gold. As old age crept upon him, Tiberius remained aloof, almost spectral in his governance. His letters to the Senate grew colder, his trust in people thinner. The betrayal of Sejanus, once his right hand, marked a turning point. Tiberius had him arrested and executed, an act of imperial decisiveness that surprised many. It showed the emperor still saw clearly, even if he chose to look from afar. When death finally came for Tiberius, it did so quietly. He died not on a battlefield nor in the Senate, but in a villa by the sea, far from the marble heart of Rome. His body was returned to the capital, wrapped in imperial honors, though the people mourned him little. Historians would judge him harshly, and yet in the stillness of his reign, the empire had not faltered. Roads were kept, armies fed, grain ships sailed, and the stars continued to wheel above the eternal city. Tiberius, the reluctant emperor, had preserved the empire's pulse even if he never sought its embrace. The empire, long accustomed to the slow, deliberate governance of Tiberius, found itself holding its breath once again when the mantle of leadership passed to Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known to history by a childhood nickname that clung to him like a shadow: Caligula. Little Boots, they had called him, for the miniature soldier's shoes he wore while following. His father, Germanicus, beloved general and scion of Roman virtue, on campaigns across the Rhine. To the soldiers he was a mascot, to the people a symbol of hope wrapped in innocence. To the empire he would soon become something far more complicated. At first Rome rejoiced. After the dour reign of Tiberius, Caligula's arrival brought laughter to the Forum and celebration to the Circus Maximus. Statues of his late father were raised anew, games were declared, debts were forgiven, and the air was thick with a giddy sense of renewal. Here was a young emperor, vibrant, charming, and seemingly devoted to the memory of Augustus. The people whispered prayers of gratitude, but as the weeks turned to months, a change began to take shape. Some said it began with a fever, an illness that struck him down mere months into his reign. He recovered, physically at least, but something in his eyes had shifted. Where once was light, there now danced a different fire, wild, erratic, and unsettling. His gestures became grander, his proclamations stranger. The court began to murmur. Caligula, it seemed, had slipped through the fingers of reason. He demanded divine honors not gradually, as Augustus had with careful diplomacy, but abruptly and without subtlety. Temples were rededicated to his divinity. He referred to himself as a god in the Senate, sometimes donning the robes of Jupiter, other times the silks of Venus. Statues of himself appeared in sacred spaces, and his portrait found its way onto altars. He appointed his horse Incitatus as a priest, perhaps even a consul, though historians argue whether this was jest, insult, or simply the emperor's peculiar sense of grandeur. The line between performance and decree became increasingly blurred. His sense of humor darkened. Trials became theater, executions were delayed not for mercy, but so he could better enjoy the suspense. Wealthy citizens were accused of treason. Their fortunes seized, their lives snuffed like candles at a feast. And yet amid the excess and the madness, there were flickers of brilliance. He oversaw ambitious construction projects, new aqueducts, grand theaters, roads stretching into forgotten corners of the empire. He pushed for the restoration of democratic institutions, though often undercut them with his own contradictions. But Rome is a city built on memory, and the memory of madness is long. The Senate, already bruised from Tiberius's coldness, now trembled under Caligula's fire. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, began to feel more like prisoners. In the end, it was they who struck the fatal blow. On a grey morning, as he walked through a palace corridor, Caligula was surrounded. The knives were swift, the betrayal absolute. He fell not with the dignity of a ruler, but with the silence of a man whose reign had outpaced his understanding of power. His death shocked the empire, but few wept openly. Rome, ever pragmatic, turned its gaze not backward but forward. The throne stood empty, and from its shadows another figure would emerge, unsuspected, unprepared, yet destined to don the purple robe. Caligula's story, though brief, left an imprint deep and wide. He was the fire that briefly illuminated the dangers of unchecked authority, a lesson written in the flicker of oil lamps and the hushed tones of Roman dinners. The stars above Rome did not change their course that night, but those who looked up could not help but wonder what spirit had passed through them during the reign of Caligula, and what would follow in its wake. When the blood of Caligula stained the stones of the Palatine, chaos did not reign. It paused. The Senate scrambled. The Praetorian Guard tightened their grip. And Rome, a city accustomed to surprise, held its breath. No one quite knew who would rule next. And then, from behind a curtain, stepped a man few had considered. Tiberius Claudius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus, known simply as Claudius, was found hiding behind a tapestry in the palace, trembling not with fear of power, but of death. His knees knocked, his voice stammered. For most of his life he had been overlooked, ridiculed, pitied. A scholar of history, yes, but to many, more suited to scrolls than scepters. He limped when he walked. His speech was uncertain. He drooled when nervous. In a world that prized oratory and poise, Claudius had become a caricature in his own home. Ignored by his family, sheltered from the court, dismissed as a harmless eccentric. And yet, the Praetorian Guard saw something in him. Perhaps it was his name, Claudius, the last adult male of the imperial family. Perhaps it was his harmless image which posed no immediate threat. Perhaps it was the fear that if no emperor was crowned swiftly, civil war might bloom. So they brought him forth, lifted him up, and declared him emperor. The Senate balked, but Rome, weary and wounded, accepted, and Claudius, unexpected and unready, began to rule. At first he governed with caution. He deferred to advisers, listened more than he spoke. But slowly, surely, something remarkable happened. The man once thought feeble revealed a mind sharp as obsidian. He understood law, he understood administration, and most importantly, he understood people. He restored the finances of the empire, reformed the legal system, and undertook massive public works. Aqueducts stretched farther. Roads were repaired. Ports were expanded. He opened the Senate to provincials, granting citizenship beyond Italy's borders, a bold and generous gesture that shocked the elite. But it was in war that Claudius surprised them most. In 43 CE, he ordered the invasion of Britain, a land long considered too wild, too foggy, too distant. When victory came, he traveled there himself, crossing the sea and standing on the foreign soil to receive the surrender of tribal kings. Rome had a new province, and Claudius had carved his name into its map. He returned to Rome not as a scholar, but as a conqueror. Still shadows clung to him. His personal life was riddled with intrigue. He married several times, often poorly. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was particularly ambitious, more so for her son, Nero, than for her husband. Claudius, aging and perhaps weary, allowed himself to be maneuvered. He adopted Nero, sidelining his own biological son, Britannicus. Whether it was strategy or surrender, no one could quite tell. In 54 CE, Claudius fell ill after a meal. Mushrooms, they said, a favorite dish. He never recovered. Whispers swirled that Agrippina had poisoned him, clearing the path for Nero. The physician who examined his body said little. The cook disappeared. The truth dissolved into the steam of history. But Claudius, the man no one expected, had ruled for 13 years. He had expanded the empire, stabilized its core, and revealed that power, when held with humility and intellect, could grow even from the margins. His statues were few, his praises often faint. But among scholars, among those who watched carefully, Claudius remained a quiet triumph, a lesson that greatness often wears a crooked smile. And in the quiet of the library he once frequented, the scrolls still bear his hand, the pages still turn to the chapters he wrote, about Rome, about kings, about the surprise of being seen. Long before Nero became emperor, long before the lyre and the flames, there was Agrippina, the woman who shaped him, shielded him, and in many ways summoned his reign into being. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, daughter of Germanicus, sister to Caligula, wife to Claudius, and mother to Nero. Her blood ran thick with imperial legacy, and her gaze never wavered from the throne. Agrippina the Younger was no passive figure drifting through the marble halls of Roman power. She was a force, elegant, calculating, poised like a blade in velvet. She had learned early that Rome was not kind to women of ambition, but she had also learned how to make ambitions speak, softly, smile gently, and still get what it wanted. Her marriage to Claudius was one of purpose. It brought her back from exile, restored her titles, and positioned her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, soon to be known as Nero, close to the imperial line. Claudius, perhaps seeking stability in his later years, adopted Nero and named him heir despite having a biological son, Britannicus. With Nero's adoption came transformation. Tutors were summoned, Seneca, the Stoic chief, among them. A strict philosophical education unfolded, designed to mold a thoughtful prince. The court, at least on its polished surface, seemed prepared for continuity and wisdom. But Agrippina wanted more than preparation. She wanted power in the present. As Claudius aged, rumors began to circulate that Agrippina, skilled in poison and persuasion, was growing restless, that the dish of mushrooms served that evening was not as innocent as it appeared, that the physicians delayed, and Claudius died not from illness but design. There was no trial, no accusation, only silence. And then Nero, crowned at 16, guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, Nero was presented as the heir of Augustus, a new dawn after the shadows of intrigue. He was young, articulate, and visibly grateful to his mother. Statues of Agrippina stood beside his own. Her face appeared on coins. She received foreign envoys and held court with senators. But Rome is a city allergic to shared rule. As Nero matured, so too did his discomfort with the presence of the woman who had made him. Agrippina, once the architect, began to be seen as an overseer. She questioned his choices, intervened in court decisions, reminded him too often that he owed her everything. Nero, flattered by sycophants and eager to shape his own myth, grew restless. The mother who once protected him now appeared in his shadow, and slowly, methodically, he began to push her away. First, her image disappeared from coins. Then her guards were reassigned. Her influence in the court was clipped, her visits to the palace fewer. Rome watched, as it always did, in tense silence. But Agrippina did not retreat quietly. She sought allies in the Senate. She reminded those around her that Britannicus, the true son of Claudius, still lived, and Nero, sensing danger in every gaze, struck preemptively. Britannicus was poisoned at a banquet, his cup replaced, his breath stolen before the main course had cooled. Now there was only Nero, yet Agrippina remained. She moved to a villa across the bay from Naples, and though no longer welcome in court, her presence lingered, an unspoken question hanging in the halls of power. Nero, still young, still uneasy, plotted the unthinkable. He invited his mother to a banquet, offered apologies, flattery, gifts, and then, as she returned across the water, the boat collapsed, designed to sink. But Agrippina, once more, survived. Bruised but breathing, she swam to shore. The next night, she was killed, stabbed in her villa. The emperor later claimed she had plotted against him. Rome, by now desensitized, did not rebel. It sighed, and so ended the life of Agrippina, woman of Rome, daughter of emperors, mother of one, slain by the very hand she had raised to rule. Yet in the silence that followed, Nero stood alone, no longer the son, the pupil, the heir. He was, now emperor unbound, and Rome ever watching began to whisper again. With Agrippina gone, and the final whispers of his early advisers, Seneca and Burrus, fading into silence, Nero stood unchallenged atop the empire. Yet, in that solitude, something within him shifted. The corridors of power, once echoing with counsel and caution, now became a theatre, and Nero at last assumed the role he had long yearned to play, not as emperor, but as artist. He had always felt drawn to the stage. Music stirred him more than martial banners, verse more than victories. In his youth he had sung under his breath while others recited laws. Now, free from guidance and restraint, he stepped fully into his imagined world, where emperors performed, and the world watched. He took up the lyre not as a pastime, but as a calling. He sang before audiences, at first private, then public. Rome, startled by this novelty, offered polite applause. Who could risk disapproval? To insult the artist was to insult the emperor. Soon competitions were arranged. Nero never lost. His poetry was published. Plays were performed. Statues were remade, no longer depicting him as a soldier or ruler, but as Apollo reborn, a divine presence of harmony and art. He wore flowing robes. He grew his hair longer. He recited his own verses, believing them to rival the epics of old. Meanwhile, the empire waited. Taxes rose to fund his performances. The Senate, increasingly ceremonial, nodded on cue. Those who questioned the direction of the state were silenced. Some exiled, others simply vanished. Seneca, once his most trusted voice, retired. Burrus died. And Nero, now surrounded by flatterers and opportunists, began to indulge his every whim. He built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace of unnatural scale. Gold leaf-adorned ceilings, rooms rotated with the sun, perfume sprayed from walls, a lake shimmered at its heart. It was not a home but a statement that Nero had transcended emperorship, but even in gold the world could burn. In 64 CE, fire erupted in Rome. It began in the crowded shops near the Circus Maximus and spread with merciless speed. Wooden tenements ignited like dry parchment. For 9 days, flames devoured the city. Temples, homes, archives, all turned to ash. Where was Nero? Some claimed he watched from a tower, strumming his lyre, singing of Troy. Others said he was far from the city, returning only to aid in relief. He opened his own gardens to the displaced. He ordered supplies, he blamed the Christians, then a small mysterious sect, and began the first imperial persecutions. Many were tortured, crucified, or burned as living torches to illuminate his feasts. But rumors endured. Had Nero started the fire to clear space for his golden house? Had he sung while Rome burned, reveling in destruction for art's sake? No truth could stop the tale from spreading, and yet the city was rebuilt, grander, with wider streets and fireproof materials. Nero imagined himself as a rebuilder, a visionary, but the people remembered only the smoke. His popularity waned. The provinces grew restless. The Senate, once cowed, now murmured. But Nero sang louder. He toured Greece, competing in games, singing before vast audiences. He brought back crowns not for conquest but for performance, and all the while Rome trembled, wondering how long the performance could continue before the curtain fell. The walls of Nero's Domus Aurea gleamed with gold, yet within them the air grew heavy. Rome, rebuilt with symmetry and shine, walked with silent unease. The emperor sang. The empire held its breath. In his mind, Nero was not merely ruler. He was divine dramatist, curator of beauty, high priest of sensation. He declared that nothing should outshine art, not even law, and thus art became the law. He composed operas in the dead of night, performed tragedies with tears real and rehearsed. He invited only those who clapped longest. Dissent became danger. Her frown could be treason, laughter, if unsanctioned, a provocation, but the empire's soul could not be gilded forever. In the provinces, where the touch of Nero's lyre was faint and the burden of taxes harsh, unrest began to flicker. In the Senate, the last embers of dignity still smoldered. Among the elite, even flattery began to feel thin. Plots emerged, quiet, cautious. The Piso conspiracy was the most daring. Senators, equestrians, poets, even guardsmen, bound not by ideology but exhaustion, sought to restore something simpler, governance without performance. The plot failed. Nero, though ever the dreamer, retained a predator's instinct. Informers, unmasked conspirators. Executions followed. Friends turned on friends. The poet Lucan, accused of treason, was forced to open his veins, reciting his verses until silence claimed him. Seneca, too, was ensnared. Ordered to die, the old philosopher accepted with stoic calm, his final moments etched in Roman memory as dignity defying tyranny. Nero had survived, but the victory was hollow. His circle grew thinner, the air around him colder. He trusted no one, spoke often to statues. He feared shadows, read omens, sought signs in stars, and always he returned to the stage. He retreated to Greece, performing in Corinth and Delphi, receiving laurels not from victory but from arrangement. He fancied himself a new Alexander, a conqueror not of lands but of applause. But Rome was slipping from his fingers. In the west, the governor of Gaul, Julius Vindex, rebelled. His cry was not for secession but for sanity. He called for a new emperor. Others joined. In Hispania, a veteran general, Galba, proclaimed himself the rightful ruler. Nero, upon hearing the news, laughed, then panicked. The Senate turned. The guard deserted. His servants vanished. He fled Rome in disguise, hoping for refuge or perhaps for some corner of earth that had not yet heard the sound of his voice. In a suburban villa, far from the gilded arches of his palace, he awaited his fate. And when the sound of approaching horsemen reached him, Nero did not weep, did not sing. He reached for a dagger, trembled, asked others to do it. None dared. So he drove it into his throat. His final words whispered into an uncaring sky, qualis artifex pereo. What an artist dies in me, and so ended the last of the Julio-Claudian line. Not in marble triumph, but in blood and silence, the golden house remained, its chambers echoing with forgotten melodies. Rome, burned and rebuilt, now turned its face away from art, back toward rule. But in the dust, in the evening wind, a question lingered. Had Nero been a madman or merely a mirror? In the quieter corners of the Palatine Hill, where rose gardens bloomed under the watch of marble eagles, and time seemed to drift rather than march, there once played a boy whose name carried the weight of a kingdom, Britannicus. Born as Tiberius. Claudius Caesar Britannicus, he was the son of Emperor Claudius, a prince in the old tradition, groomed in the fading light of noble intentions. His childhood, though gilded, was not carefree. The imperial palace, with its halls lined in polished stone and its courtyards echoing the voices of philosophers and generals, was not a place for innocence. From his earliest days, Britannicus lived under the long shadow of expectation, and later of danger. When his father, Claudius, married Agrippina the Younger, the atmosphere within the imperial family began to change. Agrippina, ambitious and unsentimental, brought with her a son from a previous marriage, Nero. What began as a political alliance soon deepened into a quiet competition, as both boys were placed on parallel tracks toward succession. Though older, Britannicus was pushed to the periphery. Nero was older by Roman reckoning, not in years but in presentation. He was adopted formally by Claudius, renamed as heir, and married to Claudius's daughter Octavia. The chessboard was set, and Britannicus, once seen as the natural heir, became increasingly sidelined. In public, he smiled, learned his Latin verses, and attended the same lessons in rhetoric and military theory. But behind closed doors the court hummed with tensions. Teachers watched their words, servants spoke in riddles, and Britannicus, once the pride of his father's lineage, learned the art of silence. Then came the whispers, subtle at first, like the rustling of leaves in a windless garden. Claudius, it was said, had begun to reconsider. Perhaps he saw in Nero too much of Agrippina. Perhaps Britannicus reminded him of simpler hopes. Whatever the cause, change was suspected. But change did not come for Claudius. It came to him. One evening, after a modest meal, the emperor collapsed. Poison, many suspected, delivered in a dish of mushrooms, a favorite of his. Agrippina, calm amid the panic, ensured Nero was proclaimed emperor before the body was cold. Britannicus, not yet 15, watched in silence as the city hailed another son. He remained in the palace, treated not with cruelty but with calculated disregard. He was watched, never alone, a prince in name only. His lessons continued, his tutors praised him, and yet the walls seemed to grow closer. Nero, now emperor, could not afford half measures. Though he presented a front of tolerance, hosting feasts, where Britannicus sat near the head of the table, his eyes betrayed unease. Britannicus had the blood of Claudius, the favor of old guards, and the quiet loyalty of many who had served his father. On a rainy night, at a gathering meant to display unity, Britannicus drank from a cup that tasted slightly bitter. He faltered. His speech slowed, and he collapsed. Those nearby rushed to aid him, but it was already too late. By the time his body was carried away, Nero was already explaining that it had been a sudden seizure. A tragic but natural end, the court murmured. Rome, always attuned to the rhythms of imperial intrigue, listened with weary resignation. Britannicus was buried with honors, but not with outcry. The story of his fall faded, softened by the lullabies of state scribes and the gentle sweep of palace dust. But in the hearts of some, those who remembered the boy with bright eyes and a scholar's wit, the name Britannicus lingered, not as a claimant, nor as a martyr, but as a symbol of a path not taken, a future reshaped by silent hands and bitter wine. And in the cool corridors of the palace, the scent of roses mixed with the memory of lost promise, drifting like incense through the ever-turning seasons of Rome. When the young Emperor Nero first looked upon the Forum as ruler of Rome, the marble pillars and the ancient arches must have shimmered with a dreamlike glow. At just 16, he stepped into an inheritance steeped in grandeur and gloom. The ghosts of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Claudius stood silently behind the curtain of his coronation, each a shadow cast upon the gilded stage. Yet Nero, in the bloom of youth, carried something different. Where his predecessors had spoken of duty, reform, or conquest, Nero dreamed of beauty. He spoke not of taxes or tactics, but of poetry, song, and sculpture. He fancied himself a patron of the muses, a Caesar with the soul of an artist. In the early years, with the counsel of Seneca and the firm hand of Burrus guiding him, the empire experienced a peculiar harmony. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote speeches that Nero delivered with theatrical flair. Burrus ensured the legions remained loyal and the streets orderly. Agrippina, the empress mother, loomed nearby, watchful, strategic, protective. Rome, for a time, breathed easier. The taxes were stable, the grain arrived on schedule, and Nero performed on the lyre before select audiences. The people were amused, the Senate cautiously optimistic. The empire, it seemed, could accommodate even a dreamer. But dreams, like fire, can illuminate or consume. Nero began to resent the whispers of caution. He felt constrained, an artist forced to play a ruler. His mother, once a source of power, now became a spectre of control. Their relationship soured, not with open fury, but with a chilling estrangement that played out in cool glances and courtly evasions. Then came the day when Agrippina's boat capsized on a quiet bay. She survived the wreck, swimming through darkness and betrayal. But her life would not survive the palace's cold calculations. A second attempt, more direct, succeeded where the sea had failed. The emperor mourned her publicly, but behind his eyes danced relief, and perhaps something darker, release. With Agrippina gone, the balance shifted. Seneca withdrew, Burrus died, and the court became a gallery for flatterers and sycophants. Nero no longer disguised his desires. He performed publicly, dressed in Greek robes, playing tragedies for audiences who dared not show boredom. He built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace of impossible luxury, with revolving dining rooms and ceilings that rained down petals and perfume. To his mind, Nero was not escaping duty, but redefining it. Why should an emperor not be adored as a god of art, a Dionysus reborn? Why should he not sculpt the world as a painter sculpts the canvas? Rome to Nero was clay waiting to be shaped by genius. But Rome was more stone than clay, the people murmured. The Senate bristled. The Praetorian Guard watched. Then, in the summer of 64, a fire erupted, an inferno that swept through the city for 9 days. The flames devoured temples and tenements, shops and shrines. Smoke curled into the heavens and ash fell like grey snow. Nero, it was said, watched from a tower, strumming his lyre, singing of Troy. Whether true or not, the image seared itself into Roman memory. To deflect suspicion, he blamed the Christians, an obscure, misunderstood sect. Arrests followed and executions, some thrown to beasts, others lit as torches in Nero's gardens. The city, stunned by fire, now trembled under fear. And still, Nero built. The Domus Aurea expanded upon the ashes, its golden walls rising like a phoenix of opulence. His dream, now fully unmoored from restraint, threatened to outgrow the city itself. Yet the emperor, in his heart, remained lonely. He sought love in fleeting faces. He married, divorced, and mourned. He traveled to Greece seeking applause not for policy but for poetry. He won every contest he entered. No surprise, for who would deny the emperor? But his victories were hollow, and the cheers choreographed. Back. In Rome, discontent hardened into plots. Senators whispered, generals hesitated, and in the provinces, one governor after another began to shift their gaze away from Nero's Rome and toward their own ambitions. The boy who had dreamed of a golden world was beginning to awaken to a city turning cold. The golden corridors of Nero's palace, once ringing with laughter and lyre songs, began to fall silent. Rome was changing, not with the suddenness of fire, but with the slow erosion of faith. Across the empire, discontent stirred like distant thunder. The emperor's dream, once radiant, was now clouded by doubt and rebellion. The first cracks did not come from the Senate, nor from within the palace. They emerged far from the marble steps of Rome, in the provinces where governors held both sword and sympathy. In Gaul, a respected nobleman named Gaius Julius Vindex raised a standard not against Rome, but against Nero. He spoke of restoration, of dignity lost, and of a Rome led astray by artifice and vanity. His message traveled faster than any courier. Soldiers whispered in their tents, merchants spoke cautiously in markets. Even slaves, whose lives rarely brushed against imperial politics, began to sense a shift in the air. Vindex did not stand alone for long. In Hispania, another governor, Galba, older, austere, and seasoned in Roman service, listened to the murmurings of discontent and took up the cause. He was no orator, no poet, but he bore the gravitas of an older Rome, and to many that was enough. Nero dismissed the news at first. He believed the rebellion to be a fleeting tantrum of provincial pride. But the murmurs grew louder. His advisers grew nervous. Letters arrived not with flattery but with warnings. The Senate, ever cautious, began to stir. Some members who had once praised his verses now avoided his gaze. Praetorian officers who had shouted their loyalty now grew quiet when his name was spoken. And Nero, the emperor who had once danced on stage with confidence, began to falter. He asked not how to fight, but where he might flee. Egypt, he thought, land of the Nile and old gods, where a man might vanish into legend. But flight requires speed, and empires are not easily left behind. As Galba's forces approached Italy, the Senate moved. For years it had bowed to Nero's whims. Now it reclaimed its ancient voice. The emperor was declared a public enemy. His statues were pulled down, his name scratched from dedications, his image turned to dust. Nero, once adored, found himself alone. His guards disappeared, his courtiers vanished. Even his slaves, fearful and unsure, abandoned him in the night. The palace, once teeming with voices, echoed only with footsteps and the whisper of wind through colonnades. He fled Rome, dressed, not in imperial robes but in a tunic too large, borrowed in haste. He rode out under cover of darkness, seeking refuge in the villa of a freedman. There, on the outskirts of the city he had once ruled, he hid, trembling, disheveled, whispering lines from his plays as if they might shield him from reality. The sun rose on his final day. Messengers brought word. The Senate had condemned him. Execution awaited. Soldiers were on their way. Faced with capture, Nero chose a different ending. With trembling hands he took a dagger, aided by a loyal few who remained. He hesitated, then drove the blade into his throat. As his vision dimmed, he muttered his final words. Qualis artifex pereo. What an artist dies in me, the boy who had dreamed in gold. who had sung and sculpted and ruled, breathed his last not on a stage, but on the hard floor of obscurity. Back in Rome, news of his death spread like fire through dry fields. Some rejoiced, others wept, and many, perhaps most, simply carried on, as Romans had learned to do under emperors who came and went like seasons. But in the silence that followed, the Julio-Claudian line had ended. The dynasty that began with Augustus, nurtured by Livia, shadowed by Tiberius, scorched by Caligula, steered by Claudius, and consumed by Nero, had reached its dusk. And in that dusk, the empire paused, uncertain, vulnerable, and waiting for the next chapter to unfold. With Nero's final breath, the marble silence of the Senate was broken. Rome had not seen such a moment in nearly a century, a world without a Julio-Claudian at its helm. The dynasty that once seemed eternal now lay extinguished like the last ember of a dying hearth. Into this vacuum stepped Servius Sulpicius Galba, summoned from Hispania, not by divine right or bloodline, but by necessity and timing. A man of the old mold, Galba was sharp-featured, stern in temperament, and committed to discipline above all. He did not charm, he commanded, and the Senate, desperate for stability, embraced him quickly, declaring him emperor before his sandals touched the forum stones. Galba arrived in Rome not to fanfare, but to wary curiosity. His entry was quiet, purposeful. He wore no golden cloak, rode no gilded chariot. He spoke of reform, of austerity, of returning to the virtues that had once made Rome great. And for a moment, the city exhaled. But Rome, with all its domes and drama, was no longer a city easily tamed. Galba's rule began with pruning. He cancelled Nero's lavish spending programs. He dismissed officials suspected of corruption or excess. He demanded loyalty and service, not adoration. In doing so, he pleased the moralists, the philosophers, and the old guard of the Senate. Yet, in his zeal to correct Nero's indulgences, Galba made enemies of those who had profited from them. The soldiers, the Praetorian Guard, the many layers of Rome's bureaucracy who had become accustomed to golden favors. Most critically, Galba broke an unspoken pact. He refused to pay the promised donatives to the Praetorian Guard, the customary bonus expected when a new emperor rose. His response, sharp and dismissive, was simple. I do not buy the loyalty of soldiers. I expect it. The guard, though silent in the moment, remembered. Galba, perhaps sensing the stirrings of discontent, sought to secure his succession. But instead of choosing the popular and capable Otho, his early supporter, and one with deep connections to the guard, Galba selected Piso Licinianus, a young noble of unimpeachable character, yet unknown to the legions. It was a decision that would hasten his downfall. Otho, spurned and humiliated, began to plot. He moved quietly, cultivating the discontent among the guard. Promises were made, of gold, of privilege, of power restored. And the guard, feeling slighted and forgotten, listened. On a grey January morning, as Galba and Piso processed through the forum, a detachment of the guard turned not to protect, but to attack. Swords were drawn, the crowd scattered. Piso fled into a temple, praying for sanctuary. Galba, aged and resolute, stood his ground, refusing to run, refusing to plead. A blade fell, then another. His body collapsed beside the same stones he had once walked upon as Rome's hope. The head of the emperor was mounted upon a spear and paraded through the streets, a grim echo of earlier times. The season of impermanence had begun. Otho was declared emperor that same day. Rome had witnessed in the span of months the end of a dynasty, the rise and fall of a moralist, and now the ascent of an opportunist. The foundations of the empire trembled, not from external threats but from within. Yet the people, ever adaptive, went about their days. Bread was still baked, water flowed through aqueducts. The races in the circus continued. The empire, though shaken, still held form, and in quiet corners of the city, some whispered a new question, not who ruled Rome, but for how long. In the early spring of the year 69, the Forum still bore the faint scent of blood and betrayal. The marble pavement had not yet forgotten Galba's fall, and the statues that once bore wreaths now wore silence. And into this tense air stepped Marcus Salvius Otho, proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, lifted not by legacy, but by ambition. He had once been Nero's companion, a man of luxury and laughter, known for his fashion, his perfumes, and his sharp wit. But beneath the silks and sandals had always been a shrewd mind and a burning desire, one that now wore the purple. Otho's first acts as emperor were swift, calculated, almost gentle. He restored order to the palace, reaffirmed Rome's rights, and sent respectful messages to the Senate. He wept publicly at Galba's funeral, trying to erase the stain of betrayal with an offering of dignity. Many in Rome, weary of chaos, accepted him with cautious hope. But Otho's reign was not born in peace. It was born in the shadow of rebellion. Far in the north, in the frosty provinces of Germania, another contender had risen. Aulus Vitellius, proclaimed emperor by his legions, now marched southward. His generals were seasoned, his troops loyal, and though he lacked refinement or oratory skill, he held a trump card, the love of his soldiers. Otho, aware of the growing threat, faced a difficult choice. He could wait in Rome, fortify the capital and rely on negotiation, or he could meet Vitellius in the field, seeking to end the conflict before it spilled too far into the heart of Italy. He chose the sword. The two armies met near Bedriacum, a quiet village that would soon echo with the clash of legions. Otho's forces fought bravely. The ground shook with the weight of Roman steel on Roman shields. But strategy, fatigue, and the seasoned ranks of Vitellius began to turn the tide. As reports of the battle reached him, Otho sat in his tent, wrapped in a cloak not of gold, but of simple wool. He read the dispatches slowly, his fingers calm, his expression unreadable. He knew the pattern of power in Rome. He had seen what happened when emperors clung too long, when civil war dragged on and cities bled. And so, before dawn the next day, he made a decision that startled even his enemies. He called his friends, his soldiers, his scribes. He thanked them. He offered words not of despair, but of reason. Then, retiring to his chamber, he took up a dagger and ended his life with quiet dignity. No great parade followed, no funeral pyre in the Forum, but those who had known him spoke of a man who, for all his flaws, had loved Rome more than victory. His reign had lasted just over 3 months, a brief candle in a stormy year. Yet it was a flame that burned with rare grace, its smoke curling into the history of a city that rarely paused for reflection. Back in Rome, the Senate grieved not with wails, but with silence. The people, so used to change, turned their eyes now to the next figure rising from the north. Vitellius, the third emperor of a single year, and the eternal city, older than any one name, prepared itself once more to receive a new ruler, even as the echoes of the last still lingered in its marble bones. When Aulus Vitellius entered Rome, he did not come as a conqueror upon a chariot, but as a man carried by the triumph of others, elevated by the loyalty of legions and the fall of a rival. The third emperor in a year that had already tasted the blood of two, Vitellius brought with him not a vision of renewal, but a hunger for relief. He had fought hard to claim the throne. Now he sought only to enjoy it. Vitellius had spent years in the provinces, where the pace of life was slower, and the rewards of command were measured not just in gold, but in feasts and flattery. In Rome, however, he found that every step upon the marble floors of power demanded calculation, restraint, and theatre. These were not qualities he cherished. Instead, he turned the palace into a banquet hall. Each day began with tastings of rare wines and exotic fruits. Dinners stretched deep into the night, accompanied by music, laughter, and the clink of endless goblets. The kitchens, once reserved for imperial banquets, now cooked constantly. Entire animals were roasted whole. Dishes were scented with myrrh and laced with honey. Wine flowed like the Tiber. To some, this return to indulgence was welcome, a balm, after the discipline of Galba and the tragedy of Otho. Senators who had once cowered now found seats at velvet-covered tables. Poets were paid handsomely to compose verses comparing Vitellius to Bacchus and Jupiter. The city, always eager for distraction, briefly gave in to the euphoria of excess. But the empire, vast and watchful, could not be fed on laughter alone. The East, where discipline remained sharp and memories long, a new force was gathering. The legions in Judea, Syria, and Egypt had not sworn loyalty to Vitellius. Instead, they had turned to another, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known simply as Vespasian. A man of stern habits and few words, Vespasian had been leading campaigns in Judea with quiet efficiency, far from the golden excesses of Rome. His soldiers respected him not for spectacle, but for stability. And when the eastern provinces proclaimed him emperor, it was not with parade but with purpose. Rome once again braced for civil war. Vitellius, informed of the rebellion, responded not with swift strategy, but with disbelief. He trusted in the loyalty of the guard, in the grandeur of the capital, in the momentum of his title. But as the legions loyal to Vespasian began their march, cutting across the empire with cold precision, doubt crept into his banquets. The Praetorian Guard grew restless. The Senate, sensing a shift, began to hesitate. The people, their bellies, full but hearts uncertain, watched as the mood of the city darkened, and Vitellius, once so full of appetite, began to wither. He tried negotiation, sent envoys, offered abdication, then rescinded it. Each day brought new rumors of Vespasian's general Antonius Primus nearing Rome, of cities opening their gates to eastern legions, of allies turning silent. In the end, the streets decided. As Vespasian's forces entered Rome, Vitellius attempted to flee. He disguised himself, hiding in a humble porter's lodge, hoping to vanish as quietly as he had once risen. But he was recognized, dragged from his hiding place and paraded through the forum. Gone were the silks, gone the perfumes. The man who had once dined like a god now walked barefoot, bloodied, mocked by a city he had tried to delight. He was executed on the Gemonian stairs, his body cast aside like refuse, a cruel echo of Nero's own last days. Thus ended the brief, bloated chapter of Vitellius. His reign had lasted just over 8 months, and yet, in that short span, he had shown Rome something elemental, that power without purpose rots from within. As the city cleaned its stones and set its eyes eastward, a new name filled the air: Vespasian, soldier, reformer, builder. Perhaps at last Rome would know peace, but peace, like power, would always demand more than wine and words. As the dust of rebellion settled over the 7 hills of Rome, a different kind of figure entered the city. Not a prince cloaked in purple, nor a senator adorned in laurel, but a soldier, sun-darkened and resolute. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known simply as Vespasian, came not with songs of glory, but with the steady tread of a man who had spent more time with maps and marching orders than with banquets. He was not born to a noble house. His family hailed from Reate, a quiet region of Sabine hills, where olives were pressed more often than coins. His father had been a tax collector. His mother, known for her tongue sharper than a soldier's blade, had once told him bluntly that, if he wished to be more than a footnote, he must earn it himself. And so he had. Years of service in the legions, campaigns in Britain and the East, had forged in him a reputation not of brilliance, but of dependability. He was the kind of commander who ate with his troops, who mended his own boots when needed, who understood that empires are not built on theatrics, but on foundations. When the eastern provinces turned to him in the chaos of 69 CE, it was not with the glee of revolution, but with the quiet hope of recovery. They saw in Vespasian a man who could restore balance, who could rebuild what had been shaken. And when his forces finally took Rome, they did so not with vengeance, but with a mandate for repair. His first months were spent not in celebration, but in accounting. The treasury was near empty. Vitellius had drained the coffers for bribes and feasts. The legions, tired and unpaid, muttered behind their shields. The provinces, many neglected or ravaged by conflict, sent urgent dispatches. Vespasian, seated at a wooden desk rather than a golden throne, read them all. He began with discipline. The Praetorian Guard was purged and reformed. Corrupt officials were dismissed, replaced with men of proven merit. Taxes were adjusted, trade encouraged, and public contracts scrutinized. The grain supply, ever the lifeline of Rome's belly, was stabilized. And then he began to build. Amid the ruins left by Nero's fire and ambition, Vespasian laid the foundation for a monument not to himself, but to the people, an amphitheater, vast and oval, to rise from the site of the Domus Aurea's lake. It would become the Colosseum, though he would never live to see its completion. In every stone there was a message, that Rome belonged not to emperors but to Romans. His reign was not without trials. In Judea the revolt smoldered on, and his son Titus continued the grim work of siege and suppression. In Egypt, delicate negotiations ensured the grain fleet kept moving. And in Rome, old rivals still whispered in atriums and porticos, watching for weakness. But Vespasian did not rule with fear. He ruled with a kind of dry wit, a Sabine practicality that endeared him to many. When told that taxing public urinals might seem undignified, he held a coin to his nose and quipped, "Pecunia non olet, money does not stink." The phrase would echo through history, a testament to his style, grounded, unsentimental, enduring. He also understood legacy. Where Nero had chased applause and Caligula divine titles, Vespasian ensured his sons would inherit not chaos, but continuity. Titus, his eldest, was named heir, and given increasing responsibilities. Domitian, the younger, was watched with wary affection. The Flavian house, though new, was built on rock. When illness finally took him, it came not as a thief, but as an old acquaintance. He met it without pretense. As his body failed, he joked with those around him, "Vae puto Deus fio." Alas, I think I'm becoming a god. Even in death, he mocked the imperial cult, reminding Rome that emperors were men first. And so passed Vespasian, a man of sweat-stained tunics and steady gaze, who had inherited the smoldering wreckage of civil war and left behind the seeds of renewal. In the cool evening air, as Rome lit its lamps and the markets closed, there lingered a rare quiet, less a silence of fear, and more one of contemplation. The city for once exhaled not in weariness, but in wary hope. In the calm after Vespasian's departure, the mantle of empire passed not to an untested youth or conniving general, but to a son prepared with quiet diligence. Titus, the elder of Vespasian's two sons, had walked beside his father through the shadows of siege and the burdens of reform. When he was named emperor, Rome exhaled, tentatively, hopefully. The city knew Titus. They remembered him not just as a commander, but as the general who had quelled the revolt in Judea. His triumph had been marked by the capture of Jerusalem, the razing of its temple, and the return of treasures paraded through Rome's arching streets. Yet even in triumph, he had worn a soldier's restraint. In person he was charming, fluent in poetry, fond of music and warm with friends. He had been Vespasian's right hand and voice of diplomacy when firmness risked becoming cruelty. But, now as emperor, he faced not just reconstruction but expectation. From the start, Titus moved differently than his predecessors. He refused to rule from fear. He dismissed charges of treason brought by informers, famously declaring that he would be no one's executioner. The prisons were emptied of political suspects, the files of spies burned. He understood that Rome needed more than stability. It needed healing. He made a promise early in his reign: no day would pass without him doing good for someone. And for a time, he kept that promise. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, just a year into his reign, it sent ash and stone skyward in a fury unmatched. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum vanished beneath a volcanic shroud, their people caught mid-step, mid-conversation, mid-life. Rome, stunned by the news, turned to its emperor. Titus did not retreat. He dispatched aid, opened the imperial treasury, and sent architects and doctors south. His letters to survivors were not laced with rhetoric, but empathy. He toured the i.e. disaster site himself, walking among the ruins and silence. For many, this was the moment they truly saw him, not as a prince of conquest, but a servant of the realm. Another trial followed. A great fire swept through Rome, devouring homes, temples, libraries. As the embers cooled, Titus again gave freely, opening his palaces to the homeless, rebuilding not for glory, but for function. Even a plague arrived, as if to test the empire's newfound peace. And still, Titus stood firm, not behind walls, but in the streets among the people, offering what comfort he could. These were not years of expansion or reform, but of response, of care. They were years that shaped memory more than monument, and for all his modest acts, Rome remembered them as golden, but golden flames can be brief. In 81 CE, after just over 2 years on the throne, Titus fell ill. The exact cause remains unknown: fever, perhaps, or poison whispered by those who favored his brother Domitian. On his deathbed he spoke few words, but they lingered like autumn mist. "I have made but one mistake," he said. What that mistake was, he never revealed. Some believe it was allowing Domitian too much influence. Others say it was more personal, a regret of the heart or a single decision in war. But the phrase haunted historians, turning the emperor's final breath into a riddle wrapped in reverence. Rome. Wept Titus, the tender flame, had burned briefly but brightly. He had been in many ways what the Julio-Claudians had once promised to be: a ruler beloved for his humanity, not feared for his wrath. He was deified by the Senate, and though the ceremonies were grand, the mourning felt deeper than ritual. Streets fell silent, not by command but by grief. The city had lost not just a ruler but a rare presence of peace. And in the marble shadows of the Colosseum, still rising from the ground, laborers paused in their work, touched by the memory of the man who had begun the gift, not to glorify himself but to give joy to the people. The death of Titus left Rome suspended in a peculiar stillness, like the breath held between verses of a hymn. His brother Domitian, younger and long overshadowed, now stepped into the vacancy, not with the applause of the Senate, nor the affection of the people, but with the inevitability of lineage. Domitian had always walked behind others, behind his father Vespasian, a figure of structure and simplicity, behind his brother Titus, radiant with charm and tragedy. In their shadows, he had learned silence, observation, and caution. Now, with no shadows left to follow, he stood alone in the light, uncertain whether it warmed or burned. From the beginning, his rule was one of contradictions. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that echoed through the marble halls of his palace and in the murmurs of the Senate. It was not born of arrogance alone, but of a deeper ache, a desire to command not just respect, but remembrance. Domitian feared being forgotten, swallowed by the towering memories of others. He cloaked himself in ceremonial rigor. Public life was punctuated by grand rituals, strict dress codes, and renewed moral laws. He tightened control over public spending, reformed the grain supply, improved the pay of soldiers, and restored discipline to the legions. Under his reign, the empire's borders held firm, roads were repaired, aqueducts extended, and temples restored. And yet, he remained curiously isolated. Where? Vespasian had laughed with the people, and Titus wept with them. Domitian kept his distance. He appeared in public rarely, always surrounded by guards, always behind layers of protocol. The people saw his statues more often than his face. Inside the palace, he wandered vast corridors in silence, often at night, lit by flickering oil lamps and accompanied only by scribes or spies. He wrote poetry and composed treatises on law and religion. He believed deeply in Rome's destiny, but his own place within it felt ever precarious. That fear bred suspicion. Informers were rewarded, trials increased. The Senate, already wary, shrank further from independent thought. Domitian's court became a place where whispers were currency, and trust a luxury few could afford, and still he ruled well. Despite the tightening grip, Rome prospered. The empire remained stable, the economy recovered. The arts, though curated, were supported. He built the Arch of Titus to honor his brother, completed the Colosseum, and expanded the imperial palace into a labyrinth of marble and gardens. But praise was rarely voiced. For those who admired him feared him, and those who dared criticize often vanished. He married Domitia Longina, a noblewoman whose presence softened the sharpness of court life. Their relationship, though stormy, endured. She bore him a son who died young, a loss that carved another quiet hollow in the emperor's already solitary world. In his final years, Domitian turned increasingly toward superstition and signs. He consulted astrologers, feared omens, and sought meaning in patterns of birds and stars. He sensed betrayal everywhere, until finally it found him. In 96 CE, a palace plot, woven by those closest to him, including court officials and even his own wife, struck while he read in his chamber. The blade was swift. Domitian fell not on a battlefield, nor in a senate hall, but within the very walls he had fortified. News of his death spread with both relief and hesitation. The Senate, long chafed under his rule, condemned his memory, a practice known as damnatio memoria. His statues were pulled down, his name was erased from monuments. His legacy, like a line in sand, was swept away by decree. And yet Rome remembered. Some whispered that he had been a better emperor than he was ever allowed to seem, that his strictness had protected the realm, that his solitude was born not of cruelty, but of longing. Domitian, the lonely laurel, had worn the crown not with joy, but with burden, and in the end it was not his reforms nor his buildings that endured, but the question he left behind: can a ruler be great if he is unloved? In the twilight gardens of the Palatine, where roses bloomed under careful care, a statue once stood, now toppled, its face worn smooth by time. Perhaps it was his, or perhaps it was just another Roman echo, whispering the truth that in this eternal city every emperor whether feared or adored, becomes history's guest. In the quiet that followed Domitian's fall, Rome stood once more at a threshold, haunted not by the clash of swords but by the erosion of trust. The Senate, weary of autocracy and shadowed terror, moved swiftly and cautiously. Their choice was not a general, not a scion of glory, but an elder statesman whose wisdom, rather than might, promised respite. Marcus Cocceius Nerva, already in his 60s, became emperor in the autumn of 96 CE. A man of letters more than of legions, of jurisprudence more than of spectacle, Nerva was known for his calm demeanor, his legal acumen, and a life spent serving quietly in the corridors of power. He wore no armor upon his arrival. His triumph was not in conquests, but in consensus. Rome, upon hearing of his ascension, neither roared with applause nor bristled with resistance. Instead, the city exhaled. After years of suspicion and spectacle, Nerva brought something rare. To the imperial office, gentleness. His reign began not with decrees of dominance but of forgiveness. He released those imprisoned under Domitian's purges, recalled exiles and outlawed the use of informers. The Senate, long cowed into silence, was invited back into relevance. His letters were written not in the language of command, but of dialogue. In the markets and the libraries, people began to speak a little louder. Streets once shadowed by fear now felt the warmth of open sky. Nerva did not seek to dazzle. He sought to heal, but healing a fractured empire required more than words. Though the Senate admired him, the army remained uncertain. They had grown used to emperors forged in camps, not in scroll-strewn studies. The Praetorian Guard, still hungry from the privileges enjoyed under Domitian, looked upon Nerva with thinly veiled contempt. An incident would test his fragile grip on power. When Nerva resisted punishing certain guardsmen involved in Domitian's assassination, the Guard revolted. They stormed the palace, seized Nerva, and demanded the heads of those they blamed. The emperor, shaken but resolute, gave in, choosing to preserve the stability of the realm over personal principle. He understood then that peace, to last, needed strength to shield it. And so, with humility and foresight, he made one of the wisest decisions of his short reign. He named a successor. Nerva turned to the provinces, to the Danube where legions held Rome's farthest borders. There he found a man who had led troops with valor, who was admired by soldiers and respected by senators. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan. The adoption of Trajan was more than a political maneuver. It was a gesture of trust, of continuity, of empire passed not by blood but by merit. The Senate approved, the legions rejoiced, and Nerva, knowing his role was nearly complete, ruled a little longer with quieter confidence. In January of 98 CE, as winter veiled Rome in soft grey light, Nerva passed away. He had ruled for just 16 months. No battles bore his name. No grand monuments lifted his likeness to the skies. And yet in that brief interlude, he had steadied the empire's heartbeat, preparing it for the rhythm of greatness once more. Trajan would go on to become one of Rome's most celebrated emperors, but it was Nerva who made that future possible, not with grandeur but with grace. History, so often shaped by conquest, sometimes bends instead to compassion. And in the story of Rome, Nerva stands not as a warrior or a god, but as a pause, a breath between storms, a moment of measured light before the empire soared once more. With the death of Nerva, a subtle shift passed through Rome. Not a tremor of fear, but a ripple of anticipation. For the first time in memory, an emperor was not merely accepted, but eagerly awaited. When Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known simply as Trajan, ascended the throne in 98 CE, Rome looked not to the past with regret, but to the horizon with hope. He arrived from the frontier, where the Danube hummed with the rhythm of marching legions and the scent of pine and campfire lingered in soldiers' cloaks. Though Spaniard by birth, Trajan was the first emperor born outside Italy, a child of the provinces now destined to guide the world, and he did not disappoint. From the outset, Trajan fused simplicity with strength. He refused to be called a god. He declined golden statues in his image. He walked among his people, spoke plainly, listened deeply. To the Senate he was respectful, to the army inspiring, to the people generous. Where others had ruled Rome, Trajan seemed to lift it. He began with bread, reviving the grain dole, ensuring the poor were fed. He expanded the alimenta, a welfare system for orphaned and impoverished children. Temples were repaired, roads were paved anew, aqueducts extended their arms farther. The baths of the city filled again with steam and laughter. But Trajan was not merely a steward. He was a builder, in stone, in law, and in legacy. The Forum of Trajan rose from the heart of the capital, crowned with a library and a great basilica. In its center, a column spiraled upward, etched with scenes from the Dacian Wars. His most famous campaign told not in verse, but in marble relief. For Trajan was also a conqueror, not of whim or vanity, but of strategy. He led his legions across the Danube and into Dacia, where golden hills yielded resistance and riches alike. The Dacian king, Decebalus, fought with courage but could not match Rome's discipline. After years of conflict, the province was secured. Dacia, rich in mines and men, became a new jewel in the empire's crown, and the gold that flowed from its mountains funded monuments, salaries, and security for generations. Yet Trajan's eyes did not stop at Europe. In his later years, he turned to the east, seeking the fabled riches of Parthia. His armies marched, deeper than any Roman force had before, capturing Babylon, Susa, and even reaching the shores of the Persian Gulf. It seemed for a moment that Rome might truly span the known world. But empires, like men, have their limits. The campaigns in Parthia stretched supply lines and tested the morale of troops. Rebellions stirred in Judea and North Africa, and Trajan, though still strong in will, began to feel the weight of years in his bones. He fell ill on the return journey from the east, the hot air of Cilicia heavy with both history and dust. He died in 117 CE, not in battle, nor in the seat of power, but on a ship near the coast, adrift between glory and home. Before his death he had named his successor, Hadrian, a fellow Spaniard, a thinker, and a soldier, chosen not by birth, but by belief. Rome mourned him deeply. Trajan was the only emperor who would be remembered with the rare and glowing phrase, Felicior Augusto, Melior Traiano. Luckier than Augustus, better than Trajan. In every formal greeting to future emperors, that phrase would echo as both wish and judgment. In death, his ashes were placed in the base of his column, his life's story spiraling eternally toward the sky. The people, the Senate, the soldiers, all remembered not just what he built or conquered, but how he ruled. He had not merely added territory, he had added trust. And in that trust, Rome reached its zenith, its farthest borders, its richest harvests, its deepest sense of identity. The world might one day recede, but in Trajan's time it stood still and bright, as if the sun lingered a little longer each evening above the eternal city. After the triumphant reign of Trajan, the empire paused, not in weakness but in thought. Rome, stretched to its greatest boundaries, needed not more war but walls, and into this moment of reflection stepped Publius Aelius Hadrianus, Hadrian, chosen heir, reluctant warrior and lover of harmony, more than conquest. He did not rise with the acclaim Trajan once knew. Whispers circled about his adoption, about the hasty declaration of succession just before Trajan's final breath. But the Senate confirmed him, and Rome, ever pragmatic, turned its eyes to the new emperor with measured curiosity. Hadrian was unlike his predecessors. He was a man of Greek, verse and Roman steel, a lover of architecture, a student of law, a traveler not by necessity but by desire. Fluent in many tongues, he wrote poetry, debated philosophy, and read the stars with as much fervor as he studied fortifications. He believed an emperor should know his empire, not through reports and envoys, but by foot, by ship, by sight. And so he traveled. For years Hadrian wandered the provinces, from the banks of the Nile to the forests of Germania, from the windswept coasts of Britannia to the temples of Athens. He did not merely observe, he listened. He ate local food, wore regional garments, rebuilt cities not to Romanize them, but to honor their uniqueness. In Britain, he saw the futility of endless frontier skirmishes, and so he drew a line, not of retreat, but of wisdom. Hadrian's Wall rose across the northern edge of the empire, a testament not to expansion, but to endurance. Stone by stone, mile by mile, it declared that Rome, now vast, would hold and cultivate rather than consume. In Greece, his love deepened for its culture, its symmetry, its intellect. He funded libraries, restored temples, and walked the agora as both ruler and disciple. The city of Athens glowed once more under his patronage, and in its streets some whispered he was more Hellenic than Roman. But Hadrian's reign was not all marble and musings. In Judea, a long-simmering tension flared into revolt. The Bar Kokhba, uprising, fierce and unyielding, demanded the might of legions and the weight of imperial resolve. Hadrian responded not with poetry, but with power. The rebellion was crushed, cities razed, names erased. Jerusalem was rebuilt as Aelia Capitolina, its old faiths and memory buried beneath Roman stone. It was a bitter chapter, one that marked him, though he rarely spoke of it. Perhaps it was this contradiction that defined him best, a builder who could destroy, a poet who could command legions, a man of peace who understood when to wield the sword. Yet amid all the roads and reconciliations, one name echoed in his heart more than others: Antinous. A youth from Bithynia, Antinous was his companion, confidant, and many believe his great love. The two were inseparable for years, traveling together, sharing meals, stargazing, debating ancient myths. But in Egypt, along the Nile, Antinous drowned. An accident, a sacrifice, a mystery. No one truly knew. Hadrian was devastated. He wept, withdrew, and then, in a gesture that puzzled some and moved others, he deified the boy. Statues of Antinous appeared across the empire. Cities bore his name. Coins, altars, and poems kept his memory aloft like a lantern in the dark. Some mocked him. Others understood. For an emperor who had built bridges and walls, it was this human bond, brief and beautiful, that left the deepest imprint on his soul. In his final years, Hadrian grew reclusive, often ill. He returned to his villa at Tibur, a sprawling complex of gardens, libraries, and fountains, a miniature empire of thought and memory. There he wrote letters, adjusted laws, and watched the seasons shift. Before he died, he named his successor, Antoninus Pius, with the condition that the young Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian's philosophical protege, be adopted in turn. It was succession not of blood but of spirit. Hadrian passed in 138 CE, surrounded by statues and silence. His tomb, a grand mausoleum by the Tiber, stood not just as a resting place, but as a question. What is the legacy of a man who built, who wandered, who loved deeply? Rome remembered him as a restless soul, a philosopher in armor, an emperor whose gaze reached farther than most, and not just across land, but into the lives and hearts of those he ruled. In a world often shaped by ambition and war, Antoninus Pius arrived like a soft breeze at dawn, gentle, consistent, and deeply welcome. When Hadrian named him as successor in 138 CE, some questioned the choice. Antoninus, after all, was no general. He had no grand campaigns to his name, no lineage bursting with legend. But he carried something rarer, equilibrium. Born in Lanuvium near Rome of a respected senatorial family, Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arrius Antoninus had lived a life of moderation and service. As a governor, as a consul, and as a friend, to Hadrian, he had proven himself not through spectacle but through steadiness. Hadrian, ever perceptive, saw in him a guardian, not just of the empire but of peace. Upon Hadrian's death, Antoninus moved swiftly, not to distance himself from the past but to honor it. He insisted on the deification of Hadrian, despite resistance from the Senate. This act of loyalty earned him the title Pius, a name that would forever accompany his reign. And what a reign it was. For 23 years, Rome knew no major war, no civil upheaval, no bloody purges or political assassinations. The legions stood vigilant but unused in grand conflict. Borders were maintained, not expanded. Instead of steel, Antoninus governed with parchment, with law, policy, and fairness. He sat daily in his study, pen in hand, reviewing petitions, revising edicts, answering letters from across the provinces. His rule was administration at its finest, quiet, just, humane. He lowered taxes where possible, funded public education, protected the rights of slaves and orphans, and insisted on ethical treatment of prisoners. The empire, vast and varied, felt the gentle touch of order. In the provinces, governors wrote back not with panic but with reports of harvests, road repairs, temple restorations. Cities blossomed. Trade thrived. Justice reached even the outer edges of imperial influence. And in Rome, where emperors once ruled with fear or fire, there now reigned calm. Antoninus never left Italy during his reign. To some this seemed aloof, but to others it spoke of trust. He trusted his legates, his governors, his generals, and, in doing so, he created a web of responsibility that functioned without micromanagement. He was the emperor who understood that greatness could be quiet. His personal life mirrored his governance. Married only once, to the beloved Faustina the Elder, Antoninus remained devoted even after her passing. He honored her memory with temples and coins, but more than that, with constancy. He did not remarry. He did not seek novelty in his later years. His household was as ordered as his empire. Perhaps his greatest legacy lay not in what he ruled, but in whom he raised. Marcus Aurelius, his adoptive son, was trained under his watchful eye, not in flattery but in philosophy, not in grandeur but in virtue. He read with him, debated with him, showed him not the trappings of power, but the burden of it. And Lucius Verus, also adopted into the imperial line, would grow alongside Marcus, forming a dual legacy prepared for Rome's future. As the years passed, Antoninus aged with grace. His beard turned silver, his pace slowed, but his mind remained sharp. He once said that an emperor must be a physician of the state, diagnosing not just with law, but with listening. In March of 161 CE, after a mild illness and a final day of routine audiences and family council, Antoninus retired to his chamber, ate a simple meal, and reportedly whispered equanimity before falling into sleep. He did not wake. Rome mourned, not with fireworks or forced grief, but with genuine reverence. The Senate deified him, temples bore his name, and in the minds of many, he became the model of a ruler, not a hero of war but a steward of civilization. His funeral procession was grand, yet serene. The people lined the streets not to wail, but to honor. In his death, as in life, Antoninus reminded the world that power, when guided by principle, can preserve peace more powerfully than any sword. He had inherited an empire of marble and mosaic. He left it even more stable, more just, more whole, and the marble whispered his name, pious, not as a title of glory, but as a sigh of gratitude. When Antoninus Pius passed into gentle memory, the purple robe of empire fell to shoulders not eager for its weight, but prepared to bear it with wisdom. Marcus Aurelius, long tutored in the stillness of Stoic thought, took his place as emperor with neither triumph nor fear, but with measured resolve. He had not been bred for luxury. His youth was spent with books, not banquets, with Epictetus and Cleanthes, not gladiators or golden circuses. Even as a child he was called Verissimus, most true, for he seemed always to carry honesty in his gaze and quiet in his step. As emperor, he brought his scrolls with him to the throne. In the deep hours of dawn, when most of Rome still slumbered, he would write in his private journal, thoughts not for decree but for self. Meditations, they would one day be called, though he never meant them to be read. They were notes to the soul, reminders that power is fleeting, anger is hollow, and virtue is its own reward. But Rome, for all its beauty, was not a philosopher's garden. From the start, the empire pressed in on him. The Danube frontier trembled with incursions. Germanic tribes, displaced by pressures farther east, tested Rome's borders with increasing force. The east stirred with rebellion, and within the Senate, factions shifted like shadows, unsure how a philosopher would lead in war. Marcus did not flinch. Though he longed for Athens and the simplicity of thought, he donned armor, mounted his horse, and rode north. He spent more years in camps than in palaces, leading campaigns with cold logic and warm discipline. He slept under tents, ate beside centurions, and governed provinces from riverbanks and forests. Alongside him stood Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, co-emperor in title, though less in duty. Lucius enjoyed the ceremonies. Marcus bore the burdens. Together they faced plagues brought home by soldiers from the east, diseases that thinned the streets of Rome and reminded all that not even emperors could command life. And still, Marcus wrote. Between battles, between judgments passed and letters sent, he returned to his notebook. You may leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. These were not the musings of fear, but of focus, of a man who ruled not to dominate, but to understand. At home, his challenges did not cease. The loss of children, the illness of his wife Faustina, and the stirrings of betrayal within his court, each chipped at his spirit, but never broke it. He endured with the grace of a man who had accepted the nature of fate, and chose each day to meet it with decency. His reign was not without darkness. The wars in the north grew brutal. Executions, though rare, occurred. Rebellions had to be crushed. But even in his hardest decisions, Marcus searched for the moral compass, asking not what pleased Rome, but what honored reason. And then came Commodus. His son, born of Faustina, was not the philosopher's mirror. He was bold, impatient, drawn to spectacle. Marcus, with a heart full of both love and worry, tried to mold him. He brought Commodus on campaign, exposed him to duty, to hardship. He hoped, perhaps, that the discipline of war would quiet the boy's impulses. But hearts do not always echo their fathers. In 180 CE, on campaign in Pannonia, Marcus Aurelius fell ill. Fever took him, and with it, the quiet flame that had guided an empire through storms and stillness. He died in his tent, no marble, no chorus, just a man and his thoughts. Rome wept, not with fear but with reverence. He was deified, his writings preserved, his reign remembered not as an age of expansion, but of endurance, reflection, and virtue. The last of the so-called 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius was not just a ruler. He was a guardian of conscience, and somewhere, in a quiet corner of history, his words still linger. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. When Marcus Aurelius breathed his last in the chill air of the Danube frontier, Rome expected grief. What it did not expect, what it feared but dared not say aloud, was what came after. Commodus, his son and heir, ascended the throne with the blood of philosophers in his veins and the fire of ambition in his heart. But it was not the kind of ambition that builds. It was the kind that consumes. Where his father had written meditations, Commodus rehearsed performances. Where Marcus had led legions, Commodus summoned applause. In him the empire found not a statesman but a spectacle. At first Rome tried to believe. The transition of power was smooth. The Senate, loyal to the memory of Marcus, confirmed his son. The people, ever drawn to novelty, cheered the young emperor. He was handsome, athletic, possessed of the charisma that flickers like torchlight in the eyes of crowds. But soon the flicker became a blaze. Commodus cared little for the work of governance. He left those duties to advisors, some competent, others cunning. What drew his passion was the arena. The roar of the Colosseum stirred him more than the voice of reason ever could. He fought in the games, not as a patron but as a gladiator. Clad in lion skins, wielding swords, he fancied himself Hercules reborn. Statues across the empire were altered to reflect this. Commodus as a demigod, muscles rippling, club in hand. Coins bore his heroic image. Decrees renamed months in his honor. He did not wish to be remembered as a ruler, but as a legend. And yet legends are brittle. Beneath the surface, Rome began to crack. His indulgences drained the treasury. His paranoia bred executions. Senators vanished. Estates were seized. Whispers turned into screams behind closed doors. His own sister was accused of conspiracy. Friends became enemies overnight. The people, once charmed, grew uneasy. The Praetorian Guard, that thin line between emperor and chaos, began to murmur. And still he fought in the arena, sometimes against men, often against beasts. He demanded victory ceremonies, golden statues, chants in the streets. He charged the city for each appearance, calling it divine tribute. But Rome, ancient and patient, had seen fire before. In 192 CE, after 12 turbulent years on the throne, Commodus was assassinated. It was not a senator or soldier who struck first, but a wrestler, his own sparring partner, sent by those closest to him. He was strangled in his chambers, the final match of a reign where performance had replaced policy. The Senate, unshackled by his death, rushed to damn his memory. Statues were pulled down, inscriptions were erased. The empire once again sought to forget, but forgetting is never simple. In Commodus, Rome had seen the danger of inheritance without character, power without purpose. He was the son of a philosopher, yet ruled as a performer. The empire he left behind was not broken, but it was shaken. The century ahead would see more emperors rise and fall, some noble, others brutal. But many would look back to Marcus Aurelius and Commodus and see in that father-son contrast a parable for all time. That wisdom is not always passed, that greatness cannot be inherited, and that even the brightest flame casts a long, uncertain shadow. And somewhere amid the ruins of the arena he so adored, echoes remain not of cheers but of a question. What becomes of an empire when its ruler seeks not to serve it, but to be worshipped by it? With the death of Commodus, a curtain fell not on Rome itself but on a chapter long in the making. The dynasty of Julio-Claudia had ended generations earlier, with Nero. Yet the echoes of that line, its majesty, its madness, its melancholy, had rippled through the Flavians, the good emperors, and finally reached their restless conclusion in the theatre of Commodus's Rome. And now there was quiet. In the days following his assassination, the city stood still. Senators convened in haste. Praetorian officers shifted loyalties like cloaks. No clear heir stood waiting. Rome had once again become a stage without a script. In that vacuum, Pertinax was chosen, an elderly senator of sound character, brief temper, and limited illusions. He tried to restore order, rein in the guard, reassert the dignity of office. But the empire had grown weary of dignity. Just 87 days into his rule, the Praetorians murdered him in the palace courtyard. What followed was unthinkable. The empire was auctioned. Didius Julianus, a wealthy noble, offered the guard a fortune for the throne. And they accepted. Rome, once governed by bloodlines and brilliance, had sold its soul for silver. The Senate confirmed him. The people hissed. The world watched in disbelief. But the soul of Rome, though shaken, was not lost. From the provinces came generals, men, hardened by war, respected by troops, each believing they could do better. Septimius Severus from Pannonia marched on Rome, seized power, and ended the farce. He dismissed the auctioned emperor with a blade, dissolved the corrupt elements of the guard, and declared a new dynasty. In him the cycle began again. And yet, something had changed. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty, with its blend of myth and murder, had established more than an imperial line. It had created a blueprint, a mirror, a question. Could absolute power be tamed by human virtue? Could succession be managed without ambition, curdling into betrayal? Could Rome be ruled by wisdom, not just will? Each emperor that followed would grapple with that mirror. Some broke it, others polished it. But none could ignore it, for in Augustus the world had seen the power of vision, in Livia the strength of quiet ambition, in Tiberius the danger of isolation, in Caligula the madness of unbound desire, in Claudius the surprise of hidden strength, in Nero the tragedy of theatrical power, in the Flavians the recovery of order, in the good emperors the possibility of virtue, and in Commodus the warning of vanity unchecked. These were not merely rulers. They were reflections of Rome, of humanity, of history's winding road, and though their statues cracked, their names faded, their reforms revised, one thing remained. The stories told by candlelight, whispered in libraries carved into stone, their lives became more than chronicle. They became myth. In the Forum the shadows of columns still stretch long in the evening, the wind still hums through the ruins of palaces, and in the minds of those who walk Rome's broken stones today, the past lingers, not as a relic, but as a rhythm of rise and fall, of silence and song. And so ends the tale of a dynasty, not with conquest, not with collapse, but with remembrance. The Julio-Claudian flame, once fierce and flickering, now rests in the embers of time. But every empire, like every evening, must one day fade into sleep.